Crossed. Maybe you can pray about that tonight. All right. Well, we are continuing our study in 2 Peter tonight, and in light of that, I've been thinking a lot about what courage we can have in the Lord, who is our source of truth, and as a contrast to the false teachers we've been studying about, my mind was drawn to Joshua chapter 1, where God is speaking directly to Joshua, the successor to Moses, the leader of God's people. And in that discussion with Joshua, God says to him, "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go." God spoke to Joshua a principle which remains true for us today, that obedience to God and his clear commands from Scripture safeguards us from danger and protects us from falling under God's wrath. We are able to, out of a heart of thankfulness for what God has done for us in Jesus, we can have a grateful life that leads to holiness and enjoy the benefits of it. We're going to sing together 659, Soldiers of Christ Arise. Let's all arise together as we sing all three verses. 659, Soldiers of Christ Arise. Amen. Thank you so much. You may be seated.
Second Peter chapter 2. And we'll be looking at verses 7 through 9, at least as far as we get tonight. You have all noticed the title of the study tonight. Aaron and Carly might say, "Move to Wisconsin." But take heart. Tomorrow is the first day of spring. Who knows, it may get up to 40. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, continuing the thought of God sparing not the angels in verse 4, the old world in the time of Noah in verse 5, Sodom and Gomorrah in verse 6, and then verse 7, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked, For that righteous man dwelling among them and seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. Can you imagine somebody writing a book by this title? How many of you would buy a copy? No, nobody's interested in vexing their soul? Okay, well, that's good. Good so far. Yet, in reality, this is the very thing far too many believers are doing today. And I think as we get into the study, you'll see why I'm saying that. And if you're familiar with this passage, as probably most of or all of you are, you already know how many believers are doing this, pretty much that same thing that Lot did, vexing their soul. It's almost, in some cases, as if they are studying a step-by-step manual on how to vex your soul. And we'll get into a little bit more of a description or definition of vexing our soul as we go on, but I think we all have a pretty good idea of what it means anyway. What we have here is a how not to manual. And maybe I should have entitled it How Not to Vex Your Soul, but it's a description here of how to do it. And so the occasion was the outbreak of heresy, which we've been reading about and studying back from verse 1 and on for the last several weeks. So we have to take this in context, of course. Everything you have to always take in context, immediate following context especially. So the occasion was the outbreak of heresy, and the purpose we really find as we turn to chapter 3 and verse 17. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing you know these things before, beware lest ye also, being led away with the error of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness. And again, this is a whole theme of 2 Peter, steadfastness or grow. Keep growing, keep adding to your faith. And by the way, before I forget, going back to chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, the things that were to add to our faith, I always knew that was an excellent list that I should pray through, but I never, you would think in 52 years I'd come up with a pretty good way to do that. But just recently, I realized that we are to add 7 things to our faith. What does that suggest to anybody?
That's faith perfected?
One a day. And so the Lord just keeps teaching me how to pray better. First it was the attributes, praying the attributes, and then the sermon Pastor did a couple of weeks ago on love. Because I realize if we don't love, we're probably not going to forgive. If we don't love, we're not going to be patient. If we don't love, we're not going to have compassion, and on and on and on. So I'm praying about that. And then also, of course, the attributes, one attribute every day. And then my own study from Colossians, those things that there are 7 of them. So I would suggest doing that. And throughout the day, I don't just go through one a day. I keep reminding myself throughout the day, pretty much every day, moral excellence. And then it gets down to knowledge, and then it gets down to self-control or temperance. And so, rabbit trail, but sorry about that, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned that tonight because I think that it can be very helpful. It was to me, and I trust it would be to you if that's something that you think you would be able to use. So, the occasion of this whole passage here is the outbreak of heresy. The purpose is warning, and we must interpret these verses within the context of the whole book. So working backwards, we see how it coincides with the theme. So, on our outline, number 1 is the man who vexed his soul. And we start by looking at his situation. We know that Lot was the nephew of Abraham, and we also know that Lot was with Abraham from the very onset of God's dealings with Abraham. He had experienced God's blessing. He had become very wealthy. He was a saved man in a privileged environment. But then we look at B, his status. Well, what does 2 Peter have to say about Lot? In verse 7, Peter tells us that he was a just man. And verse 8, that he was a righteous man. If you're using a different version, it probably would say righteous in both places there, because justice and righteous depend on the context. But the interpretation of those would be one who is innocent, faultless, guiltless, acceptable to God. Does that sound a lot like Lot to you? No pun intended there. And so he's a just man, he's a righteous man, yet what do we know about Lot's life? Well, we're told a lot about Lot in Genesis 13 through 19. And in chapter 13, verse 11, the Bible says that Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. So Lot chose the best land for himself. He looked upon all the plains of Jordan, and instead of giving Abraham actually gave him the option, and so he chose the best land for himself. Verse 12, and Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. Now that had to be an intentional choice, because the verse before tells us that Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. He could have moved as far away from Sodom as possible, but he pitched his tent toward Sodom. And then chapter 14 and verse 12, and they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So you see this gradual transition, and I'm sure probably all of you, or at least most of you, have already noticed this in the past, the downward trend here. So first he's choosing the best land, then he's pitching his tent towards Sodom, and then he's actually dwelling in Sodom. And then as we come down to chapter 19 and verse 1, and there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Now, we read oftentimes in the Old Testament about certain individuals sitting in the gate of a city. Does anybody know what that indicated? What does that mean, sat in the gate? It just was a nice place to watch the crowds go by? Is any significance in that phrase, sitting in the gate, Dan?
The gate was the place of official business in that
Yes.
day, so he was an authority figure in the city.
Yes, yes. When that phrase is used, that's an indication that he wasn't there just to do business with somebody else. He was an authority figure, as Dan said. And people would come to him with their business dealings, maybe with their arguments against each other, whatever the case might be. And so here he is. He's recognized as an authority in Sodom. Well, it doesn't stop there. We come to Genesis chapter 19, verse 8. Behold, now I have two daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. Can you imagine? I mean, this just boggles the imagination. Maybe in the back of his mind, he's thinking, well, they'll never do that. And, you know, who knows what's going through Lot's mind at this point in time. But they could have taken him up on that. I can't imagine even entertaining the idea, leave alone suggesting it to these men of Sodom. The story continues, of course. Chapter 19, verses 32 through 36. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father, let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. The downward trend just goes on and on. He is tricked by his two daughters into committing incest. Question: in what sense then could Lot be considered just or righteous? Job kind of echoed that sentiment in Job chapter 9, verse 2. He said, I know it is so of a truth, but how should a man be just with God? Good question, isn't it? And this was Job was not just being sarcastic here. He was expressing a sentiment that anybody that's thinking would also echo. How should a man be just with God? Every single one of us are sinners. But not until we come to the New Testament, in verses like Romans 3:26, to declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him, with them which believe in Jesus, of him rather. And then verse 28, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. So, Peter is writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he is calling Lot a just man and a righteous man. Kind of two sides of the same coin. Did God approve of Lot's lifestyle? Somebody please say no. No, thank you. Did Lot suffer as a result of his ungodly lifestyle?
Yes.
Can somebody tell me some ways that Lot suffered? You know, there's always consequences of everything we do, good or bad, consequences of sin. What were some of the consequences of Lot's bad decisions?
Lost his family.
Yeah. And a little bit more specific.
His wife specifically.
Wife turned into a pillar of salt. Only Lot and his two daughters escaped the destruction of Sodom.
His descendants didn't share his faith. His descendants did not share his faith.
Okay, right?
He had zero impact on that city. I mean, God couldn't find any righteous within the city, or he would have saved it.
And we might even say that he had a negative impact on the family. And what about the descendants of these two daughters? Anybody know? They became the perennial enemies of Israel. Wow. Well, of course, bottom line, God could only consider Lot or anyone else just because of Christ's work on our behalf. And so that is the man who vexed his soul. Secondly, we go to the meaning of vexing one's soul. First, we want to note that it was painful. There are two words that are used, and they're both translated in the King James vexed. In other versions, not so much. I'll tell you what they are in other versions. But in verse 7, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. Verse 8, for that righteous man dwelling among them and seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul. So it's actually two different words. And the first word is really better translated distressed. And if you have an ESV, that's probably what it says. And that word means to wear down with toil, to oppress, to weigh heavily on, to trouble. And so the idea is that in verse 7, the filthy conversation of the wicked wore down his resistance and made him vulnerable. Pretty clear to see, right? The second word that's translated vexed could also be more correctly perhaps translated tormented or tortured or distressed. So he tortured his righteous soul by exposure to evil. That sounds pretty painful to me. To wear down with toil, to oppress, to weigh heavily upon, to trouble, to torture, to torment, to distress. But not only was it painful, we also noticed that it was progressive, because verse 8 says, from day to day. So Lot is exposing himself to this wicked environment on a daily basis. Some of you may be at work, have to be around unsaved people day after day after day. Maybe some of your family members are not believers, and so you need to spend maybe a lot of time with them. So this is this voluntarily daily exposure to their wicked ways that vexes his righteous soul. So these things happen gradually. Now, this is not in the PowerPoint. I just added this a little while ago. But turning back just a few pages to James chapter 1, verses 14 through 15, we have a similar thought here. But every man is tempted. In fact, I was just waking up in the morning and these verses came to my mind, and I thought, oh God, I have to include those in my study. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and when sin is finished, bringeth forth death. So there is a progression. These things happen gradually over a period of time. We don't go from hot to cold overnight. Someone who said this, one who, in quotes, suddenly goes into sin has been taking other steps progressively. Now, Peter began this section by talking about false doctrine and false teachers. And now he's dealing with the subject that is all the way throughout the Bible from cover to cover, and that is the need for separation for the believer from the world. Love not the world, and the other things are in the world. And so gradually, bit by bit. Remember years ago, a man who fell into marital unfaithfulness. And somebody asked him the question, how did you let that happen? And his only response was, I stopped having my devotions every morning. So, that's a warning. 1 Peter 3:17, ye therefore, beloved, seeing ye know these things before, beware, lest ye also, being led away with the error of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness. If any man thinks he stands, take heed, what? Lest he fall. There's not a believer on the face of this earth that's invulnerable. We need to practice not isolation, but insulation. That was a Doug McLaughlin Something I heard from him years ago. Insulation, not isolation. Well, then the means of vexing one's soul, first of all, is by our environment. Lot dwelt among them. And that word dwell means to settle down, to dwell fixedly among them. D. Edward Hebert made this comment: the double compound participle signifies that Lot had permanently settled down among them. Lot's place of residence was self-chosen. So in other words, he deliberately chose to associate with them. Now, we certainly need to be out and about among unsaved people. How in the world else are we going to have opportunities to witness? But we dare not become a participant in their ways or their things they do, the way they live. This was a deliberate choice. And as individuals, we can make that same choice in other ways. The people we fellowship with or the influences that we allow. So one way that one can vex his own soul is the same way Lot did, by our environment, but the second is by our experiences. What did Lot do? First of all, we see the word in seeing. In verse 8, that righteous man dwelling among them in seeing. Psalm 101:3, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside. It shall not cleave to me. So what we look at greatly affects our desires. Does anybody remember the downward steps that Achan took in stealing the gold, silver, and garment? 3 steps. Saw, desired or coveted, took, and actually there's a 4th. Hid. That's why we try to hide our sin, don't we? And so it started with looking. Was there anything with Lot in the midst of the battle, his eyes falling down upon that gold and silver? No. And the idea was he didn't just glance at it and walk away. The more he looked, the more he wanted. I have an illustration about that. I was new at the senior center and playing ping pong, and I noticed several of the guys had tennis shoes with an N on them. And I had no idea what that N meant because I'd never heard of New Balance, so I asked one of them and he told me, and sure enough, I found myself wanting a pair of New Balance tennis shoes. Guess what? I'm on my 2nd pair now. I don't think they've caused me to sin. At least I hope not. What did Lot see? He saw their unlawful deeds, and who knows what in the world that looked like, but whatever it wasn't good. The word unlawful means flagrant defiance. Acting as though no law had authority over them. So first of all, in seeing, and then second, in hearing. So evidently, he must have actively listened. And what he heard worked on how he thought and what he wanted. And that's the way it works. The more we think about it, the more we want it. The more we look at it, the more we want it. Turn back to that again. Turn back to that again. Or whatever the case might be. So quickly then, the method of protecting one's soul is in verse 9. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. So God's provisions. He knows how. We don't on our own. So we need to be taught by God. Deliver us not into temptation. There is no temptation taken you, but such is common to men. But God is faithful, who will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. God knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation, but we have to learn and apply those lessons. God's provision includes, way back in verse 3 of chapter 1, all things that pertain unto godliness. God's given us everything we need to live a godly life, a God-focused life. And in verse 4 then, we got to take them, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. So God's given us everything that pertains to life and godliness. He's given us these great and precious promises. He knows how to deliver us out of temptation, but if we tried to do it on our own strength, we're going to fall. God's predictions, secondly, were that there would be false prophets, chapter 2, verses 1 through 22, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail. We're almost done. God's predictions were of the false prophets. And then fast forwarding ahead to chapter 3, the first several verses, scoffers. And of chapter 3, verse 10, coming judgment. And then we see, finally, we close with quickly God's promptings. Chapter 3, verse 11. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, these things that we're seeing and hearing, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness? Verse 14, wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent, that you may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless. And we've already read 17 twice, but 18, here it is, but grow. The overall theme of 2 Peter. Don't be satisfied with your current spiritual status. It's too easy to do. And if we're not going forward, we're not just going to stand still. There needs to be that progression, that adding to our faith. All these things that Peter teaches us and reminds us of over and over again. And as he's already said, these are not things that you didn't know. You already knew them, but you need to be reminded. So, any comments, questions?